Don't forget that I have a playlist 5 for 1000 subscribers on my channel. So, here's the deal. My sister posted something on her social media about her abusive ex. It was pretty intense, all about the toxic stuff he did during their relationship. It was raw, emotional, and just plain devastating to read. You could tell she was hurt, still carrying the weight of it all. To be fair, she'd been dealing with his nonsense for months before the breakup, so I wasn't entirely shocked she was airing it out in public. In her words, she wanted to reclaim her power, get the truth out there for everyone to see. But here's the twist, her post wasn't really going anywhere. It wasn't trending, didn't even get that many likes or comments. It was just another post lost in the sea of social media noise. So, imagine my surprise when this guy, her ex, mind you, somehow saw it. I mean, for him to have noticed, he would have had to scroll through her profile and intentionally find it. He must have been actively looking for it, which is, well, weird. But things don't stop there. He doesn't confront her directly, like you might expect. Instead, he goes to his mom, the woman who, let me tell you, has a very odd relationship with my sister. She's always been one of those he can do no wrong types, even when the whole world knew he was a nightmare. So, this woman, his mom, calls my sister out of the blue. And what does she ask? Can you please stop shaming my son? You're making him look bad. Now, you can imagine what that did to my sister. When my sister told me about the phone call, I was floored. I mean, who does that? A mother calling her son's ex to defend his honor after all the crap he put her through? My sister was already on edge, but this? This took things to a whole new level. She was livid. I've never seen her this angry. She called me up right after, practically shaking. Why is she defending him? She asked, voice tight with disbelief. She's acting like I'm the one who was abusive. At first, I didn't know what to say. I mean, I've seen the guy treat her like garbage, gaslighting her, belittling her, even getting physical once or twice, and yes, we all knew about that, but she was too scared to report it. But now his mom was playing the role of the protective mama bear, and I couldn't believe it. She was more concerned about his reputation than the harm he'd done to my sister. But the emotional impact on her wasn't just anger, it was a mix of frustration, sadness, and disbelief. She wasn't even angry at him anymore. He'd already shown his true colors 100 times, and by now, she expected nothing less. But his mom? That was something she hadn't prepared for. She told me she felt small, like no matter what she said or did, she was still seen as the bad guy in everyone else's eyes. It hit me harder than I expected. You see, I've always been protective of her, but this time, I couldn't fight her battles for her. All I could do was listen and try to make her feel heard. But my sister was stubborn and strong. She wasn't going to let this slide. Still, she wasn't sure what to do next. Was she supposed to just take down the post? Was that the right move? It felt like no matter what she did, someone would find a way to make her feel guilty. The emotional toll it took on her was real. She wasn't just angry, she was hurt. And what's worse, she felt alone. As the days went on, the situation started to gnaw at my sister. She kept replaying the phone call in her head, analyzing every word, wondering if she should have handled things differently. I could tell she was getting exhausted. There's only so much emotional weight a person can carry before it starts to break them down, and I saw it happening right in front of me. I tried to be the supportive brother, offering advice when she asked, but to be honest, I didn't know what the hell to say. On the one hand, I wanted her to stand her ground, to keep the post up and let people see what kind of person he really was. But on the other hand, I knew this wasn't something that was going to go away easily. There was no simple fix, no neat resolution. Every conversation she had with her ex's mother felt like it was adding to her burden. It wasn't just the call itself that hurt, it was the whole dynamic. It made my sister feel like she was still stuck in that toxic web, like she wasn't allowed to have her own voice because his family was so busy protecting him. They didn't care about her pain. They cared about his image. But what got to me the most was how my sister handled it. She didn't lash out. She didn't engage in some public social media war with her ex or his family. She quietly removed herself from the situation, slowly but steadily putting up walls. It wasn't a defeat, but it wasn't a victory either. It was just silence. And that silence was deafening. I began to realize that it wasn't just the physical abuse or the gaslighting that took a toll on her, it was the way she had been made to feel small for so long. How his family had always undermined her feelings and her experiences. She was tired of fighting battles with people who couldn't see the truth. It wasn't until one night when she broke down in front of me, her voice cracking as she said, "I don't know what to do anymore. I just want this to end, but I can't seem to get anyone to believe me." That's when I knew. This wasn't just about a post. It wasn't just about an ex. It was about her reclaiming her narrative. It was about her fighting for her truth, even if nobody else was going to fight alongside her. I could see it now, this wasn't just her problem. It was all of ours. And I wasn't going to let her carry it alone anymore. After that night, things started to change. I realized I couldn't sit back anymore and watch my sister drown in her own silence. She needed support, not just from me but from anyone who could understand the depth of what she was going through. I wasn't going to let her face this alone. So, I began to take a more active role. I reached out to her close friends, people who had been there for her during the relationship and even before. We created a small but tight circle of support. We all agreed that we'd help her find her voice again. No more silence. No more hiding. If her ex's family wanted to pretend that he was some angel, we were going to make sure the truth came to light. It wasn't easy. The conversations we had weren't just about telling her to stand up for herself, it was about validating her feelings and making her see that what she'd been through wasn't her fault. Too often, she'd blamed herself for staying with him for as long as she did. And I could see that it had chipped away at her self-worth. I wanted her to understand something: breaking free from that kind of abuse wasn't a failure. It was the hardest thing in the world, and her decision to leave him took more strength than anyone gave her credit for. But somehow, she had internalized the idea that she was the one who was wrong for ending the relationship. To counteract that narrative, I encouraged her to talk openly about her experience, not just to me, but to anyone who would listen, and to not care about the judgment. That was the first step, letting go of the fear of how others would view her. The more she shared, the more she realized that she wasn't alone. There were others who had gone through the same thing, they just hadn't spoken up yet. The emotional weight she carried started to lift little by little. It wasn't instantaneous, but I could see the spark coming back in her eyes. She was no longer a victim of this situation. She was becoming a survivor. And that change, that shift, was incredibly powerful to witness. But I also realized something that hit me like a ton of bricks: the impact of emotional abuse doesn't just disappear because you walk away from the person who inflicted it. The emotional scars stay. My sister had taken the first step toward healing, but there was still so much work to do. And the hardest part was ahead of her: learning to rebuild the parts of herself that had been broken down over the years. After a few weeks of support, therapy, and working through her emotions, my sister felt stronger. She was ready to take the next step, and, as expected, it came in the form of a confrontation. Not with her ex, though; he had conveniently gone silent after his mom made that phone call. No, this confrontation was with his mother. One day, my sister gets a text from her ex's mom asking her to meet in person. Apparently, she wanted to clear the air and have a calm conversation about the post, the phone call, and everything that had transpired. My sister was understandably skeptical, but there was something in her that felt like this was the final piece of the puzzle, the last thing she needed to truly move on. So, she agreed. I told her to prepare for the worst, but I also knew this was her decision to make. I wasn't going to dictate how she handled things, this was her healing process. The meeting was set at a coffee shop, neutral ground. When my sister walked in, her ex's mom was already sitting at a table, hands clasped in front of her like she was waiting for a confession. The moment my sister sat down, the mother immediately went into defense mode. She started by saying how much she understood my sister's pain, but then, in the same breath, she claimed my sister was overreacting and being too dramatic by posting everything online. Now, if you know my sister, you know she's the most level-headed person when it comes to dealing with confrontation. But this woman? This woman was trying to rewrite history. The more she spoke, the more my sister felt like she was sinking into the same old pit of manipulation and guilt-tripping. It was like she was back in the relationship, where her feelings didn't matter, where her truth was never fully accepted. But something was different this time. My sister didn't back down. She calmly but firmly explained that she wasn't going to allow anyone, not even his mother, to tell her how she should feel. She laid out the facts, the emotional abuse, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the physical intimidation. And you know what? That was the moment it clicked for me. It wasn't about winning the argument. It wasn't even about changing her ex's mom's mind. It was about her finally owning her story, without shame or hesitation. His mom tried to twist things, tried to play the victim, but my sister wasn't having it. By the end of that conversation, the woman was frustrated, and my sister was, well, I wouldn't say satisfied, but she was free. I could tell the emotional toll this conversation had on her. She wasn't angry, though, she was just exhausted. But it was a good kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from speaking your truth, from setting boundaries, from refusing to be manipulated anymore. After the conversation, she came home and, for the first time in a long time, she didn't look like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Sure, there were still scars, and there would be for a long time, but in that moment, I could see that she had taken back control of her narrative. The days following the confrontation were, well, a bit of an emotional roller coaster for my sister. On one hand, she felt empowered, like she'd made a definitive stand and wasn't letting anyone push her around anymore. But on the other hand, she also felt this lingering heaviness. Confrontation, no matter how justified, is draining. It's like once you open that door, there's no closing it, and everything that was hidden behind it comes rushing out, for better or worse. But what really got to her was the aftermath, the silence from her ex. He didn't text, didn't call. His mom hadn't said a word either. It felt like they were both just waiting for her to apologize, like nothing had ever happened. It's crazy how people who've done nothing but harm can still expect the victim to make the first move toward peace. But my sister wasn't playing that game anymore. She started to notice how people in her life, outside of her close circle, were still tiptoeing around the issue. They didn't know the details, but they could tell something was off. It was frustrating because, on the one hand, she wanted to shout from the rooftops about what had really gone down. But on the other hand, she didn't owe anyone an explanation. It felt like people were more interested in the drama than understanding the real pain behind it. One evening, as we sat together at dinner, she turned to me, her face serious. "Do you think I made a mistake by speaking up?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. I could see the weight of that question hanging in the air. I knew it wasn't about the confrontation itself. It was about whether she'd made the right choice in putting herself out there, in sharing her story. I took a deep breath and reminded her, no. You didn't make a mistake. You told your truth. And that's something not a lot of people can do. Don't let anyone make you second guess it. She nodded slowly, but I could see she wasn't fully convinced. The emotional toll wasn't over yet. That kind of abuse doesn't just vanish because you've set boundaries. The scars remain, and the healing process is long and difficult. But here's the thing I realized, healing isn't a linear path. It's messy. Some days, you'll feel like you've conquered the world. Other days, you'll feel like you're right back where you started. That's normal. And it's okay. It's part of the process. I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't let my sister go through this journey alone. She might not always want to talk about it, and she might still have days where she feels weak or unsure. But I would always be there, not to fix everything, because I knew that wasn't possible, but to support her in whatever way she needed. Because that's what family is for. And even though this whole mess had been emotionally draining, it had also brought us closer together. We were a team now, in a way we hadn't been before. And that made all the difference. A few weeks after the confrontation, things seemed to settle into a strange, almost uncomfortable quiet. My sister had done the hard work of speaking her truth, and though she wasn't getting the validation or support from his family, she was slowly learning to stand on her own. But there were still moments where doubt would creep in, where she'd wonder if it was all worth it, if it had really made a difference. What struck me, though, was the quiet strength she began to develop. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't something you could point to and say, this is the moment she got her life back. It was more like watching a plant grow. You can't always see it happening, but you know it's slowly pushing toward the light. She began picking up hobbies she used to love before her relationship with her ex had clouded everything. Painting. Cooking. Even simple things like taking long walks in the park, just to breathe and get some space. The little things that had been buried under the weight of everything else started to resurface, and for the first time in a long time, she seemed herself again. But even in those moments of peace, she'd occasionally get a text or a call from people asking about the post or offering unsolicited advice. Some people still felt like they needed to question her actions, as if the fact that she had shared her experience somehow made it less valid. The worst part? His ex's mother would send her passive-aggressive messages, sometimes pretending to care, sometimes subtly trying to guilt-trip her back into silence. I could see how it wore on her, the constant pressure from people who didn't get it. They didn't understand the emotional exhaustion that came with being in a toxic relationship, nor did they understand the weight of reclaiming your story in a world that sometimes wants to silence victims. But she handled it with such grace, better than I could have. She learned to ignore the noise, to filter out the judgment. It became clear to me that this wasn't just about her moving on from her ex. It was about her learning how to live for herself again, without apology. It wasn't just about cutting ties with him, it was about cutting ties with the version of herself that had been defined by his abuse. Every day was a little different. Some days she felt like she had everything under control. Other days, she'd fall into moments of quiet sadness, reflecting on the time she lost and the pieces of herself she still needed to rebuild. But through it all, I saw her start to embrace something important, her resilience. I remember one evening, a few months after everything had calmed down. She was sitting on the porch, staring at the sunset, and I could see her face had softened. "You know," she said quietly, "I'm not sure I'll ever forget the pain. But I think I'm finally ready to forgive myself for letting it happen." And that, right there, was a breakthrough I didn't expect. Forgiveness, not for him, but for herself. She had carried the blame for too long, thinking that maybe if she'd been stronger, things would have been different. But in that moment, she realized that she had done the best she could at the time, and that was enough. It wasn't a happy ending. There was no perfect closure, no easy resolution. But it was the beginning of something new. And I couldn't have been prouder of her. As time went on, my sister's healing didn't just stay about moving past her ex or dealing with his family. It became more about rediscovering who she was outside of the trauma, outside of the expectations others had placed on her. She wasn't just reclaiming her power from the relationship, she was learning how to rebuild a life that wasn't defined by what had happened to her. I noticed small changes in her over time. There were days when she'd talk about her goals, her hopes for the future, with a new sense of excitement. I could hear it in her voice, see it in her eyes. She had dreams she'd long abandoned. Her passion for writing, her desire to travel again, even her love of learning new things, they all started to come back. I remember one weekend when she told me she'd signed up for an art class. She'd always wanted to try painting but had put it off for years, always telling herself there wasn't time or that it was a frivolous hobby. But after everything, she decided to take the plunge, and the joy I saw in her face when she painted her first piece was unlike anything I'd seen in a long time. It wasn't just about the art, it was about her finally doing something for herself, something that made her happy. But it wasn't all easy. She still had moments of doubt, where she'd wonder if she was doing enough to heal, if there were things she was missing or not addressing. Sometimes, the memories of her ex would come rushing back in waves, and the scars would feel fresh again. On those days, she'd curl up with a book, take a walk, or call a friend. And every time, she'd remind herself that healing was a marathon, not a sprint. That it was okay to take her time, to have setbacks, and to not have all the answers yet. One of the hardest things for her was trusting people again. The relationship had not only broken her down emotionally, but it had also left her second-guessing everyone around her. She had built walls, told herself that no one would understand, and feared being vulnerable again. But slowly, she started letting people in, friends, family, even new acquaintances. She'd talk openly about her experiences and, to her surprise, found that the more she shared, the more people came forward with their own stories of struggle and survival. It created this unexpected sense of connection, a reminder that she wasn't as alone as she sometimes felt. We talked a lot during this time, mostly late at night when everything was quiet, and I'd catch her in moments of deep reflection. She'd tell me how much she hated that it took so long for her to feel like herself again, but at the same time, she started to accept that she couldn't rush the process. She wasn't in competition with anyone, not with her past self, and definitely not with anyone else's timeline. She was learning, growing, and coming to terms with the fact that this, the healing, the rebuilding, the emotional journey, was her journey. There was no rulebook, no ideal way to do it. All that mattered was that she was taking one step at a time, and every small victory mattered. And then, one night, when we were talking over dinner, she said something that I'll never forget. I don't think I'll ever fully forget the pain, but I've realized that the things I've learned through it, the strength I've found, it's a part of me now. It's a part of who I am. And I thought, damn. That was powerful. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, even in the quiet moments. Even in the times when she felt unsure, she was embracing the fact that she had survived the worst, and she was becoming stronger because of it. That moment, when she said that, marked the point where I saw her finally, truly, owning her healing. It wasn't about forgetting or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about integrating the pain into her life and turning it into something that didn't control her, but rather shaped her into someone who knew her own worth, her own strength. And that was when I knew. She wasn't just the girl who had been abused. She was so much more than that now. She was someone who had taken back control over her own life. It's been a year now since all of this started, since my sister shared her story, since her ex's mom tried to silence her, since the emotional roller coaster began. And honestly, it feels like a lifetime ago. I've watched my sister transform in ways I didn't think were possible. The girl who once shrunk in the shadow of her past is now walking with her head held high, owning her story, and stepping into the future with a quiet confidence. She's not perfect, none of us are. There are still days when the weight of the past feels heavy, and sometimes, the fear of repeating old patterns creeps up on her. But those moments are fewer now. She's learned how to handle them with grace, how to silence the voices of self-doubt, and how to stand firm in her own truth. And the most important thing I've learned through all of this? It's that healing doesn't happen in a straight line. There are setbacks. There are challenges. But the strength to keep going and to rebuild, to learn, to grow, that's what makes the difference. Every step forward, no matter how small, is still progress. I think back to that moment when she asked me if she made a mistake by speaking up. Back then, I couldn't have predicted just how much that one decision would change everything for her. But now, I can see how crucial it was. It wasn't just about making a post online, it was about reclaiming her narrative. It was about her having control over her story instead of letting someone else define it for her. That post was the first step in her journey toward healing, and though she didn't know it at the time, it set everything in motion. And the thing is, my sister didn't just find healing for herself. She became a voice for others who've gone through similar struggles. Her story inspired others to speak out, to take back control over their lives. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving, and that was something I don't think I truly appreciated until I saw how much courage it took for her to walk through this process, not just once, but every single day. Looking back now, I know that she didn't just get her life back. She rebuilt it. Stronger. Wiser. More resilient than before. And even though the journey was painful, I can see that she's come out of it with a deeper understanding of herself and the world around her. If I could offer any advice to someone in a similar situation, it would be this: speak your truth. It might be terrifying at first, but no one else can tell your story for you. And remember, healing takes time. It's not linear, and it's not always easy. But every day you choose to move forward is a victory. My sister taught me that, through her quiet strength and unrelenting perseverance. She reminded me that even when the world tries to silence you, your voice matters. And as I watch her continue on this journey, I couldn't be prouder of the woman she's become. We all have our battles, but we don't have to fight them alone. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is reach out for support, speak our truth, and keep moving forward, one step at a time. And that, for me, is the ultimate lesson from this experience: the power of speaking up, the power of healing, and the power of starting over, no matter how hard it seems.